What is the Socratic method? Asking what is the Socratic method has a familiar flavor to Socrates' own inquiries. Like Socrates' questions, what is justice? And what is virtue? Our question, what is the Socratic method, has similar outcome. The similar outcome is that attempts to define the Socratic method tend to fail upon further examination. Here is the opening line about definitions from my introductory essay, and this is Max Maxwell's introductory essay. What is the Socratic method? A single, consistent definition of the Socratic method is not possible due to the diversity with which the method, in quotation marks, has been used in history. There are many styles of question-oriented dialogue that claim the name of the Socratic method. However, just asking a lot of questions does not automatically constitute a use of the Socratic method. Even in the Dialogues of Plato, which are the most significant and detailed historical references to Socrates, there is not just one Socratic method. Although seeking a comprehensive definition of the Socratic method that covers all examples without contradiction is fruitless, we have a way forward. There are easily identifiable patterns of expression characteristic of the Dialogues of Plato that, when used in the proper Socratic spirit, dramatically increases the fertility of learning and the human aspiration to seek understanding. The Socratic method, as seen in the early Dialogues of Plato, is similar in structure to the scientific method. The structure in common between Socratic and scientific method is fundamental to human living. General structure. The Socratic method and the scientific method. 1 through 5. 1. Ask a question. 2. Form a hypothesis. 3. Test the hypothesis. 4. Accept or reject according to testing. And 5. Act accordingly. The Socratic method, in its classic form, does not seek to test our understanding of the facts of geometry, in spite of Plato's suggestion to the contrary with his Meno geometry experiment. It focuses on moral inquiry that tests ideas of how we should live, the nature of virtue and justice, and the human character and results of good living. The Socratic method focuses on moral inquiry related to how we should live in the light of the knowledge of justice, virtue, beauty, happiness, and our own human character. The Socratic method attacks the complacencies that arise when what passes for common sense in apostrophes has become too convincing. Although the heart of the Socratic method beats to the same rhythm as all scientific inquiry and human innovation, it addresses subjects that have historically been deemed to not be amenable to the inquiries of the scientific method. Yet, the structural commonalities listed in the blue box above remain intact. The 1 through 5. Living in wonder and asking questions, posing tentative answers, testing our answers, evaluating the results, and living out those results to the best of our understanding is a basic pattern of human thriving that is just as valid in the ancient Athens of Socrates as it is in our science-laden 21st century. This is something for which we are naturally born adepts. Curiosity, asking questions, and testing things are part of our natural character. The structure of using the Socratic Method, in parentheses, the exception technique, 1 through 5. 1. Focus on a common sense statement. 2. Find an exception to that statement. 3. Reject the statement if an exception is found. 4. The respondent reformulates the statement to account for the exception. And 5. Keep repeating the process until a statement cannot be overturned. Example. Question. What is justice? 1. A. Justice is the equal distribution of goods. 2. Find example of when everyone receiving the equal measure of something is harmful or obviously unfair, such as food distribution that does not account for medical dietary needs of individuals. You can also use an example when an issue of justice has nothing to do with distribution. 3. Reject statement, ask again, what is justice? 4. The respondent reformulates a statement to account for the exception. 5. Repeat until an exception cannot be found. Focusing on the scope of knowledge. Defining something implies that we have a knowledge of it. Knowledge works in the context of definable scopes of application. This particular scope issue would arise in the context of the question, what is morality? Statement. A knowledge of what is moral is needed to live well. Socratic question. To the extent that we must be healthy to live well, is it a knowledge of morality or a knowledge of medical science, diet, and exercise that helps us? Prompt the respondent to refine his statement with the question, where does a knowledge or morality help us live well? End of Socratic question. Repeat applying an evaluation of scope for each new reformulation of the above statement on morality until the actual knowledge of morality, in quotation marks, finds its scope of functioning. The classic picture of the Socratic questioning asks questions that impact how we should live. The distinctiveness of Socratic moral inquiry is that it manifests a rigorous focus on one primary question or idea. Modern debate-oriented questions on morality are characterized by an ability to throw in everything, including the kitchen sink, in order to win, in apostrophe. The focus of modern moral debate is so broad it can include inappropriate things such as ad hominem attacks or personal attacks. The Socratic focus is much narrower. The discipline of Socratic conversation is in the ability to persist in questioning a single idea. This willful repetition affords us the experience of seeing a much richer variety of answers and possible views come into play. This is part of the value of the focus of the Socratic method. It is the variety of responses that must inevitably come when we persist in questioning an idea that makes the conversation more useful. Modern debates usually offer two views that formally deny each other. Unfortunately, most subjects that have any bearing on moral issues are more complex than a mere two-sided debate can address. The Socratic method persists with a basic question that does not let go until an answer that can stand up to examination is found. This is a far more creative and fertile mode of conversation than mere debate. It is the creativity of teamwork towards a common goal. There are two main patterns in the use of the Socratic method. The classic Socratic method and the modern Socratic method. The structural observations on the Socratic method above reflect more of the classic Socratic method than the modern method. The classic Socratic method is distinguished from the modern Socratic method by the nature of its questions. The classic Socratic method pursues the big questions about justice, virtue, and other basic qualities of human character and living. Here, the answers are not known by the Socratic facilitator. The modern Socratic method asks questions about topics that have known, expected, and verifiable answers, such as the answers sought in the geometry experiment in Plato's Meno. Socratic inquiry is moral inquiry to the extent that it centers around how we should live. Socrates sought to develop good character through the subordination of the will to knowledge. Seeking good living through good character was the holy grail of Socrates' quest. In light of this distinction, I can say that the so-called classic Socratic method is more Socratic, quote-unquote, to the extent that it focuses on the big questions about life and living well. Living as a just and virtuous citizen was at the heart of Socrates' interest in gaining knowledge and understanding. The modern Socratic method, which centers around the art of asking thoughtfully designed leading questions, has more of the flavor of Plato's interpretation of Socrates than anything genuinely Socratic, quote-unquote. In the modern method, leading a student to infer the correct answer for the question, what is 1 plus 1? Or some other equally measurable fact or procedure is the focus. This is not to say that the modern style of asking leading questions to obtain knowable results can never have a bearing on morality. The modern style moves away from moral inquiry simply because it is much more often used in conjunction with non-moral data. There is an interesting correlation between knowable results and moral conflict. To the extent we have the capacity to verify knowledge, humanity tends to drift from a moral focus. It is the consensus on the methods for the verification of knowledge that produces these results. Nobody considers the moral implications of getting a correct answer in mathematics. It is simply a matter of technique or of avoiding mistakes. The agreement on methods for verifying knowledge in mathematics allows us to avoid all flavors of moral impact within the scope of the math itself. Nobody gets into a conundrum about the length of an object if they know how to measure it. There are no arguments about the nature of something if that nature can be scientifically determined. However, our long history of trying to determine the correct answers for questions about the nature of human justice and virtue is both a quagmire of stumbling in our ignorance and is also at the heart of human efforts towards achieving moral development. To the extent that we are profoundly ignorant of the means to verify knowledge, the flavors of morality more often assert themselves in our thinking. In this correlation, human ignorance and human morality have a fundamental relationship within the bounds of our epistemological limitations. With regard to the nature of justice and virtue, everyone can have an opinion. Yet nobody can articulate the methods for verifying the knowledge of such things with the same defining consensus as we possess for mathematics. Here, humanity tumbles into arguments and disagreements of frightening proportions. For Socrates, our ignorance is always the ground in which all wrongdoing has its deepest root. The primary implication I see in the relationship between verifiable knowledge and morality is that the Socratic method is more impactful in its use to lead students to positive experience of the complexity and uncertainty of issues, classic Socratic method, than it is to elicit specifically knowable facts, modern Socratic method. The focus of the classic Socratic method is better suited to teach students to embrace the ambiguities of important issues and questions with practiced confidence, sustainable enthusiasm, and cooperative social grace. Students are encouraged through positive experience to build the character traits needed to embrace the task of seeking knowledge and self-improvement in the most attentively fertile manner. When people are comfortable in confronting their own ignorance with a deeply personal quest for knowledge, they will be much more effective at digging into issues with sustainable confidence and an enhanced vigor of attentiveness. The Socratic Method, in its most fertile form, helps people learn about and build their own human character in the quest for understanding. The classic Socratic Method. A definition from the introductory essay. Quote begin. The classic Socratic method uses creative questioning to dismantle and discard pre-existing ideas and thereby allows the respondent to rethink the primary question under discussion, such as, what is virtue? This deconstructive style of the Socratic method is Socratic, quote-unquote, precisely to the extent that the weight of the actual deconstruction of a definition rests in the respondent's own answers to more questions, which refute the respondent's previously stated answer to the primary question. The result of the classic Socratic method is, by definition, a failure to find a satisfactory answer to the primary question in a conversation. This failure produces a realization of ignorance in the respondent, Socratic Effect, which can, it is hoped, inspire the respondent to dig deep and think about the question with a new freedom that is obtained from discarding a previously held belief. If a satisfactory answer is found, this represents a transition to the modern Socratic method, quote-unquote. This pattern in which ideas and definitions, hypotheses, etc. are tested and often refuted is the most widely recognized portrait of Socrates and his method. It is also the more difficult pattern to use. It tends to be applied towards very fundamental ideas such as definitions of justice, virtue, beauty, friendship, morality, courage, piety, temperance, etc. The primary question this generates in the Dialogues of Plato come in the form of what is X, quote-unquote, and then what is X, quote-unquote, in apostrophes. Questions such as what is justice? What is virtue? What is beauty? Were a powerful focus for Socrates as presented in the early and some latter dialogues of Plato. Political and religious world leaders, philosophers, artists, and human beings from all walks of life have pondered such questions for as long as there have been the spare time to think. Yet, after thousands of years in the development of our various civilizations, we are in short supply of any comprehensive understanding. I have pondered such questions in my own living for decades, and if the world depended on my ability to give final knowledge of such things, we would be doomed. I can say right now that you will not be leading students to any final knowledge about such questions through a short Socratic-style Q&A session jammed in between other curriculum. However, you may guide your students to experiences of discovering the joy of asking good questions that inspires them to be more thoughtful about important questions for the rest of their lives. When a human being learns to love to ask questions and be persistent in seeking answers, they become the creators of new possibilities for the future of humanity. The type of questions the classic form of the Socratic method attends to are very different from the information most often addressed in the modern Socratic method. Examples in application of the classic form are below under the subtitle Applying the Classic Socratic Method, and this is from the socraticmethod.net website. The modern Socratic method. My own research is focused on making the classic Socratic method easy to use. There is an important measure to which the so-called modern Socratic method is not really Socratic. Apostrophe. Even Plato's use of this style tends to favor Plato's agenda that which is most recognizably Socratic. In this case, Plato's interest in the structure of human knowledge and remembering is less Socratic to the extent that it is an exercise in epistemological experimentation and not a moral inquiry. However, the modern method is part of the tradition of interpreting the Socratic method and is currently the most widely used pattern. This art of questioning has value with and without Socrates. The modern method can be applied to any form of data which has a structure amenable to human inference that the teacher wishes to elicit in the minds of their students. This style of questioning is easy to learn and apply for your own purposes. It presupposes that you have a knowledge of the subject and a goal that is measurable and verifiable, not like asking, what is virtue? Here is part of the definition material from the introductory essay. Quote begin. The modern Socratic method is a process of questioning used to successfully lead a person to knowledge through small steps. This knowledge can be specific data, training in approaches to problem solving, or leading one to embrace a specific fact or belief. The type of knowledge is not as important as the fact that with the modern Socratic method, the knowledge gained is specifically anticipated by the Socratic questioner. This stands in contrast to the classic Socratic method in which the actual outcomes are unknown by all parties. End quote. Examples of the modern pattern. The geometry experiment in Plato's Meno. The oldest example of this style of questioning is in Plato's Dialogue Meno. Meno, after it opens with the question, "What is virtue?" then proceeds to demonstrate the idea of teaching a fact of geometry through asking questions. You can review a sample of questioning from Plato's Meno with the link below. And again, this is from socraticmethod.net. This pattern is not unfamiliar to you. Asking leading questions that connect a person to a capacity to make simple inferences exists with and without Socrates. The important thing to realize is that the method is not about getting a right answer as much as it is about cultivating the human character of students to experience an enhanced comfort and interest in asking questions and doing their own original thinking. This is because any implementation of the Socratic method that makes students less comfortable asking and answering questions is worthless, regardless of how many right answers may come out of that particular setting. If right answers are more important than stimulating the curiosity of the students and empowering their psychology to persist in seeking answers to their questions, a lifetime of a student's quality of thinking could be compromised by the quest to obtain the right answers of the moment. The Garlikov example. The article by Rick Garlikov is an important example of what must be done in order to advance our knowledge and use of the Socratic method. To use the Socratic method requires that we experiment on our own. The thoughtfulness of Garlikov in this real-world test of Socratic questioning is an excellent example for all of us. Garlikov's article documents a useful experiment on using the Socratic method to teach the concept of binary math in a third grade classroom. And it's on socraticmethod.net. The link is called the Socratic Method, Teaching by Asking Instead of by Telling. Commenting on his expectations of this experiment, philosopher Richard Garlikov wrote, begin quote, "This was to be the Socratic method in what I consider its purest form, where questions, and only questions, are used to arouse curiosity and at the same time serve as a logical, incremental, stepwise guide that enables students to figure out about a complex topic or issue with their own thinking and insight." End quote. Garlikov gives us a transcript of his experience introducing a new quote-unquote kind of arithmetic, binary math, to students in the third grade using only questions. The subject of binary math was chosen precisely because it is more difficult than what third graders are normally exposed to in the classroom. Garlikov was told by two of the elementary school teachers that only a few of the students in the third grade class would be able to understand the ideas. In a complete subversion of the low expectations of those teachers, he reports that by using the Socratic method, 19 out of 22 students fully understood the topic. Although the time of day was chosen specifically because it is the worst time of day for concentration, Friday afternoon, 2 weeks before summer vacation, none of the students were bored or could not focus. Garlikov reports that this style of teaching through questions allows for continuous feedback regarding student understanding through the student's response to questions, is excellent for maintaining interest and participation, allows students with different abilities to go at the same pace without anyone getting bored, and focuses on student understanding instead of teacher presentation. Garlikov says that In order to be effective, questions must be 1. Interesting, 2. Incremental, 3. Logical, moving from the student's prior knowledge towards a goal, and 4. Designed to illuminate particular points. In order to be effectively leading, questions must be specifically structured in a manner that is very different from the classic Socratic method. In the classic form, there is only one primary question, such as, what is justice? Or what is virtue? In the classic form, the respondent can offer literally anything as a definition of justice or virtue, and there is no way to guarantee the verification of those definitions. Dealing with that kind of unpredictable variation has a different structure than the modern incrementally related set of questions. In the modern method, the scope of the questions must be smaller and more sequentially linear in order for the logic of the focus to successfully lead students to expected and measurable outcomes. This is a very different reality from the Socratic teacher who has no idea, Socratic irony, about the correct answer, apostrophe, to what is X. X, quote unquote, what is X, apostrophe. Type questions about justice, virtue, and beauty. Again, this is a very different reality from the Socratic teacher who has no idea about the correct answer to what is X? Type questions about justice, virtue, and beauty. Most importantly, although the rigors of one's teaching agenda may relegate this to a side benefit, Garlikov reports that 2 interesting benefits of using the Socratic method are that it gives the students a chance to experience the attendant joy and excitement of discovering, often complex, ideas on their own. And it gives teachers a chance to learn how much more inventive and bright a great many more students are than usually appear to be when they are primarily passive, end quote. In these benefits, both the classic and modern form of the method share an identity. His comments on the work that needs to be done when a teacher wants to design a Socratic process for their classroom is valuable for anyone wanting to try this for their own subjects and classes. And you can read the above link at socraticmethod.net to Garlikov's full explanation. Be sure to read the whole thing. Some of his best comments are at the bottom in a section called My View About This Whole Episode. If you desire to read more of his comments and explanations, read the following link after reading the primary article above. Using the Socratic Method by Rick Garlikov. Again, it's on socraticmethod.net. Comparing Garlikov and Plato. Plato thought that his geometry focus on the dialogue of Meno demonstrated that the so-called modern Socratic method, apostrophes, has proved his idea that we already know everything and just need help remembering. I'm going to read that again because I didn't get it myself. Comparing Garlikov and Plato. Plato thought that his geometry focus in the dialogue Meno demonstrated that the so-called modern Socratic method was proved his idea that we already know everything and just need help remembering. So there is a mistake. It says was. I'll read it a third time. Plato thought that his geometry focus in the Dialogue Meno demonstrated that the so-called modern Socratic method proved his idea that we already know everything and just need help remembering. Quote in the remembering. Garlikov's experience demonstrates that it is not Platonic anamnesis, but the straightforward act of using the student's previous knowledge as a basis for guiding the students with carefully designed, logically leading, not psychologically leading, questions that help them make simple inferences. The chain of observations and inferences elicited in a Socratic process leads the students to be able to come to the information, ideas, conclusions that the teacher desires to hear from the students through their own capacity for reason, because the teacher only asks questions. The chess example. Teaching chess with the Socratic method. In this example of the pattern of the modern method, I teach a beginner chess player 2 ideas about positional chess. Instead of just telling the student the ideas, I get the student to come up with and explain the ideas to me, as I limit myself to only asking questions. Here, the student becomes the teacher. Although this example is limited to be just enough for illustration purposes, the whole of positional chess play can be taught with the Socratic method. You will not need to know how to play chess to read this, as the answers are illustrated on the chessboard in a way that non-chess players can understand. Comment about the examples. The 3 examples of the modern Socratic method above all presuppose the existence of a common visual reference. Plato's Socrates drew geometry figures on the ground for everyone to see. Garlikov and students wrote on the board, and my chess example uses a chessboard and pieces as a basis of observation and thinking. Although it is true that many subjects can use questions to teach without visual references, this tends to be more appropriate for older and more developed students. If you can provide visual references, or even base your questions entirely on something they can see, the visual references will help keep students focused and thinking. Visual references create a shared space for thought and questions that is constantly present, no matter who is talking. If you have read all 3 examples, you should have some idea that you can do this. Garlikov wrote that there is no magic trick to running a Socratic process in a classroom. It will take significant planning and practice to adapt this style of teaching into your subjects. Due to the severe limitations that your job as a teacher imposes on your focus and time, you may only be able to run a Socratic process in the classroom for select occasions. It is the goal of the research of this site, and again this is socraticmethod.net, to articulate a basic grounding in principle for using both the classic and modern form of the Socratic method. The theoretical idea is to empower a teacher who has sufficient practice to be able to spontaneously adapt a Socratic process on the fly. When this level of fluency is achieved, the teacher can adapt a Socratic process into their work environment in spite of time and resource limitations. The key insight on this grounding in principle is to allow for the individual teacher facilitator to design her own Socratic process and to express her own unique capacities as a Socratic teacher. Teaching with the Socratic method works best when it is part of the art of your own living. The essay on this website's homepage goes into greater detail about the above definitions. Now we move on to what is foundational to all applications of the Socratic method and all presentations of a designed Socratic process in a classroom. And that is kind of long, so you can go to the socraticmethod.net and check it out yourself. And the details. A lot of details. Yikes! How does one engage in an act of Socratic questioning in response to that definition? And the definition was, the lawyer's definition of justice contains enough debatable complexity to keep the conversation spinning in non-Socratic circles for quite some time. Yikes! In closing, the structure of Socratic dialogue. The structure of Socratic process will be discussed in its most broadly applicable terms, which will allow for diversity in interpreting the method's application to your setting. This will be done with a view to simplifying the interpretation of the real-time conversation demands that arise during your Socratic process. Simplification is key. Remember the Vlastos and Graham quote above. Again on socraticmethod.net, it said that the practice of the Socratic method, begin quote, calls for no adherence to a philosophical system or mastery of a specialized technique or acquisition of a technical vocabulary. It calls for common sense and common speech, end quote. This truth will be expressed in a focus on reducing the complexity of conducting a Socratic process through the principle of reducing the need to depend on the semantics of natural language, offering principles for optimizing the structure of your questions, and demonstrating how you can take an example of specific technique and apply it to a much broader range of topics and experiences. The goal here is not to learn some overly technically predefined Socratic method that is applied in a mechanical or static manner, but to become able to be a Socratic facilitator extemporaneously in a freestyle fashion that is shaped by your own ability to design and create. Those who excel at this task deepen their living mastery of the art of teaching. A principled foundation for creating innovative Socratic method exercises. An examination of what is needed to create innovative Socratic exercises will be presented with a view to allowing teachers, facilitators to construct in their own style Socratic experiences that have significant beneficial impact on student participation, enthusiasm, and learning. Examples and the principles that underlie them will be discussed with a view to applying those principles to your own Socratic innovations. Using the Socratic method in written form, examples of Socratic writing will be discussed with a view to distilling some basic principles of Socratic writing. And conclusively, toward a formal Socratic method, research implications for developing a formal system capable of conducting a Socratic process are discussed. A primary dilemma is the need to free the process from the semantics of natural language. A demonstration of the ability to reduce the Socratic facilitator's full dependence on natural language can be currently read in my essay, The Semantic Independence of Socratic Focus. And this is again from SocraticMethod.net by copyright 2014, Kenneth J. Maxwell Jr. All rights reserved. Again, if you want to read more, read the essay, The Semantic Independence of Socratic Focus. This can be done on SocraticMethod.net. Okay, I'm going to read the abstract here from the article. It's named The Semantic Independence of Socratic Focus by Max Maxwell, not Kenneth J. Maxwell Jr. Max Maxwell. My mistake. So the abstract is here. The classic Socratic method, as found in the early dialogues of Plato, has been part of the philosophical and educational imagination of Western civilization for many centuries. However, its actual use in real conversations has been limited, to say the least. The reason that the full richness of the classic Socratic method has never been commonly used in teaching or philosophical discussion can be expressed in one word: semantics. Natural language, semantics, impose a world of difference between two minds. In real life, two people can discuss the same ideas using the same words, and yet each person evokes different associations and meanings which lead them to derive different inferences and conclusions. The primary historical research on the Socratic method is the text of the Dialogues of Plato. If the Dialogues of Plato have ever inspired you to try to use the Socratic method in live conversation, your attempt will have taught you the significance of the fact that Plato was able to write the answers as well as the questions. The ability of human language to generate new sentences and express new ideas is extraordinary. This ability is so great that you simply cannot predict what a person will say in response to any question. One unexpected response is all that is needed to derail a process of Socratic questioning, if the Socratic questioner is employing the method in a static fashion. In these essays, I will focus on the classic form of the Socratic method, which seeks to define a particular term or idea and is famous for a particular Socratic effect. Apostrophe. This Socratic effect exists when people's attempts to verbalize their understanding of a term or idea while under Socratic questioning makes them sensitive to previously unknown or unacknowledged inconsistencies and ambiguities. The Socratic Effect leaves them feeling less sure of the adequacy of their understanding, and thus makes them better prepared to look into the issue with a fresh perspective. The only people who cannot think about an issue are the ones who think they already know. Creating opportunities for people to experience the Socratic Effect is very important in order to lead people to a superior experience of critical thinking. My approach to the use of the classic Socratic method is to employ simple principles that serve to remove the overwhelming semantic complexity involved in interpreting the responses to questions. These principles also guide the formation of new questions. Instead of seeing the Socratic method as a static process with a list of fixed questions and necessary understandings for each subject, the questioner employs simple principles that are open-ended, dynamic, and can express some independence from the semantic content of particular responses to questions. These principles allow for the successful incorporation of unexpected responses and ideas into the process of Socratic questioning without requiring that the questioner be an expert in the subject of the discussion. There are two patterns in the Socratic method. The classic Socratic method is distinguished from the modern Socratic method by the nature of its questions. The classic Socratic method pursues the big questions about justice, virtue, and other basic qualities of human character and living. Here, the answers are not known by the Socratic facilitator. The classic method is much more difficult to use due to the unpredictability and semantic complexity of the responses. The modern Socratic method asks leading questions about topics that have known, expected, and verifiable answers, such as the geometry experiments in Plato's Meno. See the main article, Introduction to the Socratic Method and its Effect on Critical Thinking, for more information on the structure of the classic Socratic Method and modern Socratic Method. Available at www.socraticmethod.net. Thank you very much for your time. Actually, I just realized that this essay is not very long, so I'm just going to read it here. The Semantic Independence of Socratic Focus by Max Maxwell. The first principle of Socratic questioning: structural constraint. Human language and chess have something in common. Chess, like language, can generate an amazing number of new forms. There are more possible games of chess than there are stars in the universe, a great many more. Yet, using the goal of the game of chess as the evaluative criterion, most of these possible games are junk. There are only a relatively small number of the total possible chess games that are useful or interesting. The same is true of conversation. Human language can generate more possible statements and questions than can ever be anticipated in an organized manner. Most of the possible verbal statements and questions are not useful to any particular intelligent conversation Socratic or otherwise. And what is needed is a way to constrain the possibilities in a manner that serves the Socratic goal of refuting a definition in Socratic style without being bogged down by the ocean of semantic possibilities that are inherent in more complex responses to basic questions such as, what is justice? I first realized the amazing usefulness of constraining the permutation complexity of a generative system, such as language, through an unusual chess experience. Although I had played chess here and there since I was a child, while working on a master degree I started playing once a week at a club. I was typical patzer, a poor player. After a couple of months of weekly play, I dedicated 1 month to studying the structure of the game for the first time using a book that taught the principles of positional chess play. I spent a lot of time over the next month learning how to incorporate the knowledge of positional principles into my chess play. Prior to studying positional play, chess seemed like a messy and unpredictable game. I found the principles of positional play made much of the game seem simple, organized, and easy to understand. These principles gave me a framework for understanding the game. At the end of that month, I had the opportunity to play a chess grandmaster who at the time was one of the top players in the world. I went into the game knowing I would be handily swept off the board in much less time than the 90 minutes allotted for the game. To my surprise, I survived the opening and the middle game. The game was exhausting, and I had only 5 minutes left on my clock. As my time was running out, I blundered, lost a piece, like the rank amateur I was, and promptly resigned. I looked forward to hearing from the Grandmaster about all the things I did wrong. I asked the Grandmaster to analyze my game prior to my obvious mistake so that I could learn. He told me that he had nothing to say and that I could not have played better. At this point, I was stunned. How was it possible that after 1 month of the study of positional play, I could do so well against the chess grandmaster? The answer to that question is that we had played an opening that was relatively non-tactical and heavily favored positional considerations, exchange variation of the French defense. In such games, a sound knowledge of positional play is a great equalizer. All I had to do was carefully attend to positional knowledge and not drop a piece. I learned that a little knowledge of structure excuse me, while I maintain my personal associations. I learned that a little knowledge of structure, well, I learned that a little knowledge of structure, well attended to, goes a long way. In a more tactically complicated game, he could have easily swept me off the board with his eyes closed. Excuse me. The Grandmaster performed such sweepings in later games while he played me blindfolded. even though my abilities with chess calculation and tactics were not much improved, the principles of positional play still allowed me to raise my game far beyond my highest expectations and play a respectable game against a world-class player. This worked because the positional principles constrained my attentiveness to useful structural considerations of chess play. With regard to the idea of constraining the possibilities, these principles gave me easy to understand reasons to reject a great many possible chess moves. The rules allowed me to focus much more efficiently and limited the possibilities of the game in a way that was productive. The principle I will describe in this series of essays have a similar dynamic for understanding the use of the Socratic method. They will greatly limit the possible directions in which a Socratic conversation can go by focusing our attention on the structure of Socratic dialogue. In chess, it takes more than positional play to be a real chess master. Although the same is true with regard to mastering the Socratic method, these principles can take you far. By working to be persistently attentive to principles derived from the observation of the structure of Socratic dialogue, you can raise your Socratic game and use the method more effectively than you ever thought possible. An illustration of structural constraint in the classic Socratic method. Constraint is fundamental to the productive use of Socratic method. Managing and limiting the unwieldy diversity of possibilities inherent to human dialogue is very necessary. There are a variety of constraining principles that relate to the structure of Socratic dialogue, which we will examine. We will look at them in detail in later essays, but for now I want to illustrate how a simple principle can greatly reduce the difficulty of interpreting complex or unexpected responses to a Socratic question. Illustration of a grammatical constraint. In the late 1980s, I was doing research on the Socratic method and conducted a survey that asked people the question, what is justice? A lawyer gave the following definition of justice. Justice is the restoration of actual human behavior according to the expectations of natural law. End quote. Leave it to a lawyer to come up with that one. This response illustrates why the classic form of the Socratic method is almost never used. What kind of follow-up questions do you use to move the Socratic process forward in response to such a wordy and conceptually dense definition? What does it mean by actual human behavior? What is natural law? What are its expectations? Which historical source will have more weight in our understanding of natural law? Will it be Aristotle through Thomas Aquinas? Perhaps we will lean towards Thomas Hobbes. What of the Islamic understanding of natural law? The lawyer's definition of justice contains enough debatable complexity to keep the conversation spinning in non-Socratic circles for quite some time. Below is an illustration of how a simple principle constrains our focus. and simplifies the process of interpreting and responding to the lawyer's definition while moving the Socratic process forward. In the example below, it is not necessary to worry about the many different directions a dialogue may move as a result of such a difficult definition. The Socratic questioner can take control of the conversation by limiting her focus to a simple structure. Do not worry about understanding the full context of this principle now. Just take note of how this principle frees the Socratic questioner from having to attend to most of the semantic content of the lawyer's definition. The principle of verbal proceedings. When encountering a complex definition of a term, just look for the main verb or the verb in noun form. Then ignore the rest of the definition and formulate further questions around the verb. This particular constraint results in attempting to link the action of the verb to a specific field of knowledge. This is because all actions, verbs, conducted by a willing participant require a context of knowledge, even for the simplest of things. Socrates often sought this connection through reference to various arts and trades. In the lawyer's response, restoration apostrophe is a verb in noun form. Heeding the principle of verbal proceedings, just focus on the verb and then proceed to link it to a field of knowledge. The following is one possible result. Socrates: can a human being have any knowledge of justice? Lawyer: yes. Socrates: that is good news. I seem to be lacking in the knowledge of justice. Please tell me, what is justice? Lawyer: justice is the restoration of actual human behavior according to the expectations of natural law. Socrates: so justice is a kind of restoration. Tell me, whenever we restore anything, do we not always need some kind of knowledge to help us? Lawyer: what do you mean? Socrates: if I want to restore a piece of antique furniture to a fine condition, I must know how to treat the wood and what materials and methods to use. If I want to restore the engine of a car, I must have a useful knowledge of auto mechanics. When justice restores actual human behavior, must we not have some knowledge that makes the restoration through justice possible? Lawyer: yes, you would need the knowledge of the expectations of natural law. Socrates: when actual human behavior is inhibited by the disease of the body, do we require the knowledge of natural law in order to effect this restoration, or is it the knowledge of medicine that is needed? Lawyer: you would need the knowledge of medicine. Socrates: and if badly designed shoes were hurting someone's feet to the point that it inhibited their actual human behavior, is it the knowledge of natural law or a better knowledge of shoemaking that is more restorative. Lawyer: the knowledge of shoemaking is useful in this case, or at least the knowledge of where to get better shoes. Socrates: it seems sometimes that the knowledge of justice and its relationship to natural law is not required to restore actual human behavior. Lawyer: that appears to be true. Socrates: then in what area of life is the knowledge of natural law required in order for justice to restore actual human behavior? Question mark. End of dialogue. So far, this small dialogue has already shown that the scope of application of the knowledge of natural law is not adequate to cover all possible instances of restoring actual human behavior. In quotation, in apostrophe. Quotation. This leads to difficulties for the lawyer's definition that can be pursued. Exposing problems with proposed definitions is at the heart of the successful use of the classic Socratic method. This example was still possible even though the Socratic questioner did not have to know a thing about the meaning of actual human behavior or natural law. If you have some knowledge of natural law, you may certainly follow up on that. If you have insight on how to follow up on the meaning of actual in the phrase actual human behavior, you may do so as well. The use of constraining principles in this system does not mean that you cannot do other things if you have the knowledge. However, in the absence of such knowledge, these principles will give you a baseline of Socratic method functionality to get you going. You have seen from the snippets of dialogue above that it is not even necessary to know what actual human behavior or natural law is in order for the Socratic questioners to successfully use those terms during an application of the Socratic method. This simplification is possible because the focus of Socratic questioning is on the verb. This example illustrates that we can still function as a Socratic questioner even in the context of our own ignorance. We can continue to formulate follow-up questions that can successfully apply the Socratic method to concepts, even if we have no knowledge of those concepts. A little knowledge of structure is all that is needed. In this case, a little focus on grammar and the basic relationship between human action, verbs, and human knowledge makes things much easier. At this point, many very different continuations of the dialogue are possible. There are so many that some of you should be wondering how it is possible to accommodate them all. Yes, it is possible. All responses that result from sincere participation in Socratic dialogue can be interpreted and responded to through a variety of principles that constrain the conversation to simple structures that are useful for philosophy and teaching. Keep in mind that the principle of verbal proceedings is just one tool in a set. Once you're familiar with all the tools, you can use and combine them at will. Like chess, the intelligibility of human dialogue benefits from constraint. In Socratic dialogues, this intelligibility is measured in terms of moving the Socratic process toward its goals. Attending to the structure of Socratic dialogue gives us the necessary constraints. We need to raise the quality of our use of the Socratic method. As the principles of precisional chess play provides productive limits to the game of chess by focusing attention of specific structures, the structure of Socratic dialogue will provide us with productive principles to assist us in the application of the Socratic method. The Socratic questioner will have her attention limited to the most important structures relevant to moving the Socratic process along. This will provide a new baseline of effectiveness in using the Socratic method. In the next essay, I will begin to describe this framework of principles in a way that is organized to enable the practice of them. And I just realized that I actually said apostrophe where I mean the quotation marks. So apostrophe is something different. But at the time of use, I meant quotation marks. And how to apply the principles of verbal proceedings to other topics coming soon at the www.socraticmethod.net. In the meantime, you can look at Socratic Dialogue I wrote, which applies the principle of verbal proceedings and the one example technique in the classic Socratic method to a modern topic. And this is again copyright 2009 to 2014, Kenneth J. Maxwell Jr. All rights reserved. The dialogue below was experienced in various real discussions prior to being written into a single text. The moral bankruptcy of faith. This dialogue demonstrates that faith without knowledge is insufficient to fulfill morality. Religious faith always requires secular knowledge in order to actually be moral. Remember the relationship between verbs and knowledge. So that's the article. Or Socratic Dialogue, actually. It is a Socratic Dialogue called A Modern Example of the Socratic Method, The Moral Bankruptcy of Faith by Maxwell. All rights reserved. Very interesting. Thank you for listening, and good luck with your applying the actual Socratic method.